We welcome you back to America's Forum. I'm J.D. Hayworth.
And I'm John Bachman. Jay, let's take a closer look at those Afghan elections set to be held this weekend. People in Afghanistan voting on their next president on Sunday could mark the country's first democratic transfer of power, but increased security measures have been put in place in an attempt to keep the Taliban from derailing the election. There's been a lot of violence over the last few weeks. Now, if the vote fails, divisions could tip the country into a full-blown civil war. Joining us right now on the set is D.C. International Advisory's Christian Whiton. It's great to see you, Christian.
Great to be here.
Yeah, Christian, often you're Skyping in from the West Coast. Here you are at Newsmax TV in sunny South Florida. We should point out that a few months ago you wrote a book, Smart Power, Between Diplomacy and War. Now, there's a third aspect we need to talk about, and it's free and fair elections. With the Taliban out to perpetrate all sorts of acts of violence and disrupt what's going on in Afghanistan, can the upcoming elections there be characterized as free and fair?
I think so. You know, within reason, there are going to be some irregularities. This is not a country that has a long tradition with democracy. Quite the opposite, of course. Taliban is doing their best to make this difficult. In fact, targeting foreign journalists in particular, moving away from targeting U.S. troops. They still do that. There's still a lot of risk there. Just today, an AP reporter was murdered, another one injured. And, you know, this is really sort of a change there. But you are going to have a succession, an election, a movement away from Karzai to his replacement. And, you know, this is relatively good progress for Afghanistan.
I can remember the last Afghan election when I was serving in the House of Representatives, and the purple finger for ballot security and how that became a symbol of free and fair elections. And yet we have seen, how could we say this, perhaps diplomatically, since you served at the State Department, the erosion of a common vision between Hamid Karzai and leaders here in the United States. Karzai's administration, a brother in the opium trade, all sorts of talk about corruption. Who are we likely to see as the next president of Afghanistan?
Well, there's a field, there are a number of candidates, and one of their former foreign ministers is probably the most likely to win there, but it's actually unclear, and that is another sign, I think, of some health, that there's actually vigor and competition in the election. It is an opportunity. You know, Karzai himself has moved away from the U.S., but you could also say he's been pushed away. You may recall Vice President Biden essentially endorsing his opponent in the last election, even though it was certain that Karzai was going to win, corruption or no corruption. Not really a smart move. And Karzai has had to make deals with the bad actors in his region. He is a survivor. So he is, I think, corrupt. He is definitively, or his broader family, involved in moving a lot of heroin to places like Russia and beyond, or the antecedents of it. But, you know, an opportunity now, it may not be resolved this weekend when the elections are held. You have to get 50% or more. So it could go to a runoff. And that's a big question for us, because Karzai has said it's not for him, but it's for his successor to sign a status of forces agreement that would keep some U.S. forces there.
We talked about that prospect, Chris, of full-blown civil war in Afghanistan. Now, if we've seen these attacks at election offices around the country. If the election does fail, how far are we from seeing that full-blown civil war?
You know, I think it's a possibility, but it seems unlikely, because it doesn't seem that the Taliban has the capability to cause a true failure. Undoubtedly, some people will be prevented from going to poll somewhere in that very large country. Some people will be intimidated. Some people will be punished for after the fact, because the Taliban has said that anyone who participates is you know, going on their bad list, if you will. But ultimately, I think that the process will occur. The Afghan forces and NATO forces will see to it, so there will be a you know, transfer of power in Afghanistan.
Well, let's talk about what else is going on in the world. We'll weave our way back to the Middle East. We've got a little more than 3 minutes remaining. Very quickly, news coming from NATO that the Russians, and that to think of a Russian ambassador to NATO, to me, still boggles the mind.
That's very
my
odd.
post-war mentality. But that ambassador has been recalled. What is happening now with NATO, with Russia, and Russia's designs on the Ukraine?
It's unclear. I mean, it should be obvious that NATO can get back to its basics, which is keeping Russia out. I mean, originally the joke was it was to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in throughout the Cold War. And it may be getting back to that now after a decade and a half of focus on other things, in this case, you know, Afghanistan and the mission there, and a decade before that where it sort of languished, a little bit of lack of clarity what this alliance means. Now, working against that, however, is the fact that a lot of member states other than the U.S. really spend a pittance on defense. Not just countries like Spain, which are quite far away from the Russian threat, but even ones right next door, even our very good allies, the Poles, spending only between 1% and 2% of their GDP. Also, NATO announcing its new general secretary as Stoltenberg, the former prime minister, left-wing prime minister of Norway, who really I felt was, and I think many felt, was anti-U.S., rooting against the U.S. in Iraq when President Bush called him to give him a congratulatory phone call, sort of turning it into a political thing and announcing he was going to withdraw Norway's forces from Iraq. So you have this alliance at a political level which may not have the clarity it needs.
Well, with the specter of that Norwegian taking over NATO, let's move to the Middle East, where it seems that, and by my lights, a form of rational thought may be returning. Earlier this week, Chris, you had to talk about Jonathan Pollard, the convicted Israeli spy, being released on the flimsy notion that by the Israelis giving up 400 Palestinian prisoners, the peace process might continue. And now look at John Kerry saying we need a reality check. For Kerry to say that now, after all that's fallen apart, your quick assessment of what's happening in the Middle East with the Israelis and the Palestinians?
Well, it's going nowhere fast because clearly both sides don't share an interest in bringing it to an end. You know, this is the problem that every single administration, Democrat or Republican, has. They come to town. The Bush administration resisted at first, but at the end, Condoleezza, the Annapolis process, thinking you're going to get the deal of the century, and the Palestinians will sell it over and over again, but never deliver the goods. So, you know, I think this is something that's the white whale for a lot of diplomats, and thinking this will solve all the problems in the Middle East, and it just never does.
So a reality check indeed. Christian Whiton, we appreciate your insights today, and of course the book again, Smart Power Between Diplomacy and War, as we're looking for solutions in the 21st century. You have provided the text and the tome to perhaps point that way for us.
Well, thank you, JD. I appreciate that.
It is good to have you, and we look forward to your next visit, whether here with us at Newsmax TV headquarters or via Skype from one of the many far-flung locations, including the West Coast, where we often see you.
Great, thanks. Great to be here.
Great meeting you, Christian. More to come here on America's Forum. We'll take a look at your comments coming up later in the show, but first we need to send them in to us. You can find us on social media at Newsmax TV, hashtag America's Forum. That's our Twitter account. And find us on email, connect@newsmaxtv.com. And there's always Facebook, facebook.com/Newsmax TV. More ahead here on America's Forum.